The morning David Hudson rode into Caldwell, Kansas. The sky was the color of a bruise, and the wind carried the kind of dust that worked its way into a man's lungs and stayed there like a bad memory. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell was the sort of town that sat right on the edge of the Kishom Trail, where cowboys came through driving thousands of longhorns north, and where every saloon, every general store, and every hardscrabble homestead carried the particular smell of desperation mixed with hope. The cattle drives kept the town alive, and the debt collectors kept half the town in chains they couldn't see but could certainly feel. David had been riding since before sunrise, coming down from his spread about 12 miles northeast of town, where he kept a modest but well-tended ranch. He was 27 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that curled just slightly at the edges where the sweat from his hat brim had dampened it. His jaw was square, and his eyes were a shade of brown so warm they sometimes looked amber in the afternoon light. He was the kind of man who didn't speak much, not because he had nothing to say, but because he believed words were currency and ought to be spent carefully. His horse, Monarch, was the finest animal in 3 counties. A black stallion with a white blaze down his nose, 16 hands high, with the kind of chest and haunches that made every man who saw him stop what he was doing and stare. David had raised Monarch from a foal, had gentled him himself, had trained him with patience and a kind hand. The horse was worth more than everything else David owned put together, and he knew it, and he didn't care, because Monarch wasn't a business arrangement. He was something closer to family. David rode into town on that bruised morning to pick up a shipment of wire fencing from the general store, nothing more and nothing less. He had not planned on what happened next. No man ever plans on the thing that changes his entire life. He was tying Monarch to the hitching post outside Harlan's general store when he heard the raised voices coming from across the street. Not a fight exactly, more like the sound of a man who had decided that volume and authority were the same thing, and a woman who was quietly refusing to agree. David paused with Monarch's reins in his hands and looked across the hard-packed dirt road. There was a man named Silas Drummond standing on the porch of what used to be the Graves farmhouse office, a squat building that had once served as the land deed and supply office for the family's farm. Silas was a heavy-set man in his 50s, dressed in the manner of someone who wanted you to know he had money without being gauche about it. He wore a brown wool suit with a watch chain, and his face was perpetually the color of a turnip left out in the sun. He was the man in Caldwell who held other men's debts, which made him the most powerful and least liked person for 30 miles in any direction. Standing on the lower step, looking up at Silas but not backing down from him by so much as an inch, was a young woman David had never seen before, and he was quite certain he would have remembered if he had. She was perhaps 23, wearing a dress that had once been the blue of a summer sky, but was now washed to something closer to the color of pale creek water. Her dark brown hair was pinned up but coming loose at the sides in the morning wind, and her eyes, even from across the street, were visibly striking, a deep violet gray that matched nothing else in the landscape around her. She was not tall, but she carried herself like she was, with a spine like iron and a chin that refused to drop. "Miss Graves," Silas was saying, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air, "I am not here to cause you any distress. I am simply here to inform you that the 60-day extension your father was given has expired. The debt is now $140, and as of this Friday, if it is not settled, I will be filing the appropriate documents at the courthouse, and that farm will become the property of Drummond Holdings. The farm has been in my family since before this town had a name," the woman said. Her voice was steady and clear, and it carried the kind of controlled calm that meant she was working very hard to keep from saying something that couldn't be taken back. "My father is recently in the ground, Mr. Drummond, and I would think that even a man of your occupation might allow a moment of human decency." "I allowed your father 12 months of human decency," Silas said flatly. "The debt remains." David stood still by Monarch's side. He was not the sort of man to involve himself in other people's troubles. He had learned early that trouble had a way of spreading, like a grass fire, and a man who walked into someone else's fire often ended up burning. But there was something about the way that woman stood on that step, not begging, not weeping, simply holding her ground with everything she had against a man who had all the structural advantage, that made something move in David's chest that he couldn't quite name. He looped Monarch's reins over the post and crossed the street. Silas noticed him first, because men like Silas always kept their eyes open for interruptions. He turned his turnip-colored face toward David with the expression of someone who had just discovered a mild inconvenience. The young woman turned too, and up close her eyes were even more striking. There was intelligence in them and grief, and a stubbornness so deep it had settled into bone. "Morning," David said, addressing Silas. "Hudson," Silas said, with the particular way wealthy men said a name when they were indicating that they knew exactly who you were and had already assessed your worth and found it manageable. "I couldn't help but overhear," David said. "Then you heard a private matter and I'd suggest you move along." $140, David said. He wasn't asking. He was confirming a number, the way a man does when he's already started doing arithmetic in his head. Silas stiffened. "That is the sum owed to me by the Graves family, yes. And it is none of your concern." David looked at the young woman. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, somewhere between wariness and a fragile and carefully guarded hope that she clearly didn't want him to see. "I don't believe we've met properly," David said to her, ignoring Silas entirely in the way that only a man with nothing to prove can ignore someone trying to assert authority. "David Hudson. I have a ranch northeast of town." She hesitated for just a moment, assessing him the way anyone living hard on the frontier learned to assess strangers, measuring the distance between what a person presented and what they actually were. "Violet Graves," she said finally. "My family has the farm on the South Fork of Hackberry Creek. Has had it for how long?" 18 years, she said, and something in her voice cracked just slightly on those two words in a way she immediately controlled. "My parents built it from nothing. My father passed 4 weeks ago. My mother has been ill for some time. I have a younger brother, 15 years old. We are all that is left, and we will lose everything by Friday if I cannot find a way to settle this debt." David nodded slowly. He turned back to Silas Drummond. "I want to propose a trade," he said. Silas blinked. "I beg your pardon." "That black stallion tied up across the street," David said. "Monarch, you know him." Every man in Caldwell knew Monarch. It would have been impossible not to. Something shifted in Silas Drummond's face. A greedy light came into his small eyes. Monarch was worth $200 easily, perhaps more to the right buyer. Silas was many things, but he was not stupid about money. "What exactly are you proposing?" Silas asked, trying to keep his voice level and mostly failing. "I'm proposing that you take Monarch in exchange for the full settlement of the Graves family debt, with a signed and witnessed release of any further claim against their property." The silence that followed was so complete that David could hear the distant sound of a rooster somewhere behind the feed store. Violet Graves had gone very still beside him. He could feel her looking at him, but he kept his eyes on Silas. "That horse is worth considerably more than $140, Silas said. "I'm aware. You'd be taking a significant loss. I understand arithmetic, Drummond." Another pause. Silas was doing his own arithmetic, weighing the horse against the quarterly income a repossessed farm might bring against the social and legal simplicity of a clean exchange. David could see the calculation happening in real time on the man's face. "Done," Silas said. David felt something settle in his chest, a decision made and accepted. He had not allowed himself to feel it fully until this moment, and now that it was done, there was a strange and unexpected peace to it. "We'll need it written up," David said. "Witnessed. I'd like the deed to the Graves farm noted as fully and permanently clear of any obligation to Drummond Holdings. No loopholes, no fine print." "You've done legal work?" Silas asked with some surprise. I've watched enough men get robbed through paper to know what clean paper looks like. They went into the land office to draw up the document. Tom Hartley, who served as the town's notary and general factotum for anything requiring a stamp and a signature, was summoned and arrived looking confused, then more confused as the terms were explained to him, then simply resigned to the fact that the world was strange and his job was to stamp things. David signed. Silas signed. Tom stamped. Monarch was formally exchanged for the full and permanent settlement of the Graves family debt, $140, with the farm on the South Fork of Hackberry Creek noted as entirely free and clear. David walked out into the street and untied Monarch from the post. He stood with the horse for a moment, his hand on the stallion's warm neck, his face pressed briefly against that black cheek in a gesture so private and unself-conscious it was almost startling to witness. He murmured something against the horse's ear that no one else could hear. Then he handed the reins to Silas Drummond's man, who had been waiting in the street with the faintly dazzled look of someone watching a dream unfold. He watched Monarch walk away down the main street of Caldwell, and he made himself watch until the horse was out of sight, because looking away would have been a kind of dishonesty about what it cost. Then he turned around, and Violet Graves was standing 5 feet behind him. She had been watching him say goodbye to the horse. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with happiness. "Why?" she said. It was such a direct and simple question that it deserved a direct and simple answer, and David found he didn't entirely have one ready. He had acted on something he hadn't fully examined yet, and now she was asking him to explain it, and the explanation felt elusive. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said. "You don't know me," Violet said. "You don't know my family. You didn't owe us anything." "No," he agreed. "Then why?" She asked again, and this time it wasn't just a question. It was something closer to a challenge, because she was a woman who had learned that nothing in this world came without a cost, and she needed to understand what she had just incurred. "I expect nothing back from you," David said, and he meant it with the simple directness of a man who had decided to mean it completely before he acted on it. "The farm is yours. The debt is settled. That is the whole of it." She stared at him. The wind moved a strand of dark hair across her cheek, and she didn't push it away. "That is not an answer," she said softly. David looked at her for a moment. The sun was fully up now, and the light was coming over the rooftops of Caldwell's Main Street in long, warm bars of gold. "I'll tell you honestly," he said. "I saw a person standing their ground against something unfair, and I had the means to make it fair. That's all I can say that's true." She was quiet for a long time. "My father would have wanted to thank you himself," she said at last, and her voice had changed, become quieter and more careful, because she was carrying grief that was fresh enough to still be bleeding. "He was a good man, a proud man. Losing the farm was already breaking him before the illness took him." "I'm sorry for your loss," David said, and he meant that too. Violet Graves looked at him with those violet gray eyes, and something in her expression shifted, not into softness exactly, but into something more honest than what had been there before. "My name is Violet," she said, as if they were meeting again properly this time, "and I owe you more than I can repay." "You don't owe me anything," he said. "Then perhaps," she said, with a careful precision that was entirely her own, "I might offer you breakfast at least. It is the least I can do, and I'm a reasonable cook." He didn't smile, not quite, but something in his face changed in a way that was adjacent to a smile, a kind of warmth that arrived and settled there without fanfare. "I wouldn't say no to that," he said. The farm on the South Fork of Hackberry Creek was about 2 miles south of town, down a rutted track that passed through a stand of cottonwood trees, before opening out into the flat, grassland plain that stretched toward the creek. The farmhouse was a solid 2-room structure with a covered porch, built from locally cut timber that had weathered to a gray silver that caught the morning light in a particular way. There was a kitchen garden along the east side, not yet planted for the season, the soil turned and waiting. There was a small barn and a chicken coop and a kitchen garden plot. It was modest and well maintained. the kind of place where you could see the evidence of people who worked hard and cared about what they had built. Violet's mother, Alina Graves, was sitting in a rocking chair on the porch when they arrived. She was a woman who had once been strong. You could see it in the structure of her face and the set of her hands, but illness had drawn something out of her over the past year and left her lighter and quieter than she had been. She watched David approach with the particular attention of a woman who has learned to read people out of necessity. Violet explained quickly and without drama what had happened. She said simply that the debt had been settled and that the farm was safe, and she said that David Hudson was the man responsible. Alina Graves looked at David for a long moment. "Young man," she said quietly, "I do not know what led you to do such a thing, but I am going to pray for your well-being every night for the rest of my life, and I mean that with my whole heart." David removed his hat. "That's more than I deserve, ma'am." "I'll be the judge of that," Alina said, and a small, warm smile crossed her worn face. Violet's younger brother, whose name was Henry, was 15 and already nearly as tall as David, with his sister's eyes and his father's jaw, and the particular lanky uncertainty of a boy who had been pushed by circumstance into growing up faster than he should have had to. He came around the side of the barn when he heard the wagon, looked at David with the sizing-up look that young men give to other men they aren't sure about yet, and then looked at his sister with a question in his eyes. "The farm is safe," Violet told him. Henry's face did something complicated. He pressed his lips together and looked down at his boots for a moment, and David had the grace to look away and give the boy that private moment. Then Henry looked up and said, "Thank you, sir," to David, with a directness and control that David respected. "Don't thank me," David said. "Just take care of your family." Henry nodded once as if this were a contract. Violet made breakfast, good honest food, salt pork and eggs from the chickens and cornbread in the Dutch oven, and coffee strong enough to hold a horseshoe. They sat at the wooden table inside the farmhouse, and David ate and they talked, the kind of careful getting-to-know-you talk that happens between people who are both interested and both cautious. He learned that Violet had been born in Missouri and had come west with her family when she was 5 years old. She had been educated by her mother, who had been a schoolteacher before she married, and she had read everything she could get her hands on, mostly agricultural pamphlets and dime novels, which she admitted with a self-deprecating candor that made David want to laugh, which he mostly suppressed. She learned that David had come to Kansas 7 years ago from Tennessee, had worked as a cowhand on the big trail drives for the first 3 years, had saved enough to buy the small spread northeast of town, and had been building it slowly ever since. He raised cattle, not many but good quality, and he had been planning to breed monarch as part of a longer-term strategy to improve the quality of his working horses. When he said this, Violet set down her fork and looked at him steadily. "So that horse was not just a valuable animal," she said. "He was part of your plan for your ranch." David picked up his coffee cup. "He was, and you gave him away anyway." He shrugged, a small movement that was somehow eloquent on him. "Plans can be rebuilt. Chances to do what's right don't always come back around." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said with a careful deliberateness, "You are a strange man, David Hudson." "People have said similar things," he said. "I mean it as a compliment," she said. He looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup, and for just a moment, something passed between them, a current of recognition, the very first subtle beginning of something neither of them was ready to name. He rode back to his ranch on foot that morning, having hitched a ride with Pete Garfield's mule wagon as far as the Hackberry Creek crossroads, and then walking the remaining 4 miles. It was a longer trip than usual. He didn't mind it. He had a lot to think about. The first thing he thought about and kept circling back to was the expression on Violet's face when she asked him why. Over the following weeks, David found reasons to pass by the Graves farm. They were not elaborate or dishonest reasons. He had wire fencing to string along the south pasture, which genuinely did take him near the Hackberry Creek road. He had a horse that needed the farrier in town, which genuinely was in the direction of the farm. He had a question about a particular variety of winter wheat that he genuinely had heard Eleanor Graves had experienced growing. That last one, he said to himself and winced, because it was thin enough to see through, and he knew it. But each time he stopped, Violet came out to meet him with that measured, careful quality of hers, and they would talk. Sometimes it was brief, a few minutes leaning against the fence in the afternoon light. Sometimes it stretched longer, into the golden hour before sunset, when the cottonwood trees threw long shadows, and the creek murmured somewhere in the willows beyond the south pasture. He noticed things about her the way you notice things about a painting you keep returning to. The way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking hard. The way she set her hands on her hips when she was about to disagree with something. The way she laughed, not often, but when she did, it was a real and complete laugh, unreserved, the kind that made you want to say something else funny just to hear it again. She noticed things about him too, though she was more guarded about showing it. She noticed that he always arrived at whatever task they were discussing with already having thought through 3 or 4 angles of it. She noticed that he was patient, in the specific and deliberate way that a man is patient when he has chosen patience over a natural inclination toward something else. She noticed that he asked her opinion, and then actually listened to it, which was not a thing every man in 1878 Kansas did with any regularity. About 3 weeks after the incident with Silas Drummond, David came by the farm on a Tuesday afternoon to help Henry repair the barn roof, which had developed a leak over the winter that Violet had patched temporarily with canvas, but which needed proper attention before the spring rains intensified. This had been arranged honestly. David had offered and Henry had accepted, and the two of them worked together on the roof through the afternoon with the particular comfortable silence of people who are at ease in each other's company. Violet brought them water twice and didn't hover, which David appreciated. At the end of the day, when the roof was properly repaired and Henry had gone to see to the evening chores, Violet walked David to the road and they stood together in the late light, and for the first time the silence between them was slightly different, a little more aware of itself. "Can I ask you something?" Violet said. "You can ask me anything," David said. "Do you have family, in Tennessee or anywhere else?" He considered this for a moment, the way he considered most things, with an attention that didn't rush. "A brother in Nashville," he said. "We write when there's something worth writing. My parents passed, my mother when I was 12, my father 5 years after that. No wife. No children." She absorbed this. "Do you want them? Eventually, I mean, a family." He looked at her directly then because the question deserved the full weight of a direct look. "Yes," he said, "eventually." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked out across the pasture toward the creek. The sun was going down behind them and the light on the far bank of the willows was the color of hammered gold. "My father used to say," she said, "that the land only keeps you if you keep it." He meant it about farming, but I think he meant it about everything else too. "That's true," David said. "I've been thinking about what you did," she said. "About why. And I think I understand it now in a way I didn't at first." "What do you understand?" She turned to look at him, and the fading light was on her face and her violet-gray eyes were clear and direct. "I think you are a man who cannot walk past something that is wrong without trying to set it right, not because you expect anything from it, but because you cannot bear to be the sort of person who walks past it." The accuracy of this was so complete and so surprising that David felt it like something physical, like the snap of cold water. "That's a generous reading," he said, though he meant, "that's the most seen I've felt in years." "I'm only generous when I believe something is true," she said. There was a pause. "Violet," he said. "Yes," he stopped. Whatever he had been about to say had arrived at his lips and then reconsidered itself, because it felt too large for a Tuesday evening at a fence post. "I'll come by Saturday," he said instead, "if that's all right. Henry mentioned the north pasture gate needs new hinges." She looked at him for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, as if she was reading the rest of what he hadn't said. "Saturday would be fine," she said. "He came on Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and the one after that." By the middle of May, it had become a pattern that everyone in Caldwell had noticed, and exactly one person had commented on, which was Pete Garfield at the feed store, who remarked to David with the pointed casualness of a man who is not being subtle, that the South Fork Road must be getting a lot of use lately. "Road's fine," David said, buying his feed. "I'm sure it is," Pete said, grinning at a point somewhere above David's left shoulder. What was growing between David and Violet was the slow and layered kind of feeling that does not arrive in a flood, but builds like a river in spring, quietly and persistently, until the banks are full. It was built from conversations and silences, and the accumulated small moments of two people learning each other with real attention. It was built from the afternoon Violet showed him the journal her mother had kept since coming west, full of observations about the soil and the weather and the prices of things, and from the way Violet's voice changed when she read certain entries aloud, the ones about her father. It was built from the morning David arrived at the farm to find the milk cow had knocked over the water trough, and the yard was a mud disaster, and he spent an hour fixing the trough and helping Violet herd the cow back to her proper place, without either of them getting particularly frustrated, which was actually quite an achievement because the cow was spectacularly uncooperative. It was built from the evening it rained suddenly and violently, as the Kansas prairie could rain, without warning and without mercy, and David and Violet took shelter in the barn and sat in the warm hay smell listening to the rain hammer the roof they had repaired, and talked for 2 hours without either of them noticing the time. That evening in the barn was when it shifted from building into something else. They had been talking about what Violet intended to do with the farm going forward. It was a practical conversation about the summer crops and the cattle she was thinking of acquiring, and the question of whether to hire a hand for the season. But somewhere in the middle of it, the practical conversation became a different kind of conversation, the kind where you realize you are no longer talking about the subject you started with. "I've been alone a long time," Violet said, in a moment of honesty that seemed to surprise even herself. "Not without people. Henry is here and Mother when she's well enough, but alone in the sense of being the one who carries all of it." "I know that feeling," David said quietly. "Do you?" She asked, and she wasn't challenging him. She was genuinely asking. "7 years on that ranch," he said. "Building something that's entirely yours is a satisfaction, and it's also a particular kind of loneliness." She looked at him in the low light of the barn with the rain making its steady noise on the roof above them. "Why haven't you married?" He didn't hesitate. "I haven't met a woman I wanted to marry." She absorbed this with the careful attention she gave to most things. "And what would that woman need to be like?" He looked at her steadily. "She would need to be the kind of person who tells you the truth, who doesn't back down from what she believes in, who is smart enough to know what matters and strong enough to hold on to it." Violet was quiet for a moment. "That's a very specific description," she said softly. "I'm a specific person," he said. The rain fell outside and the lamp in the barn corner burned with a small warm light, and neither of them spoke for a while, and the silence was the kind that doesn't need filling. Then Violet said, in a voice that was quieter than usual, "David." "Yes. I don't know how to be someone who depends on another person," she said. "I've been doing everything myself for long enough that I'm not sure I remember how." "I'm not asking you to depend on me," he said. "I'm asking you to let me stand next to you. Those are different things." She looked at him for a long time. "Yes," she said, "they are." It was not a declaration. It was not a kiss. It was simply two people recognizing something true together in the middle of a rainstorm, with the smell of hay and rain and lamp oil around them, and the prairie outside doing what it always did, which was be enormous and indifferent and somehow, in the right company, beautiful. When the rain eased, David rode home in the wet dark and couldn't stop the feeling in his chest from expanding the whole way. He came back the next morning, which was not a Saturday. Violet was in the kitchen garden, planting bean seeds in the turned rows of soil, and she looked up when she heard his horse, and something came into her face that she didn't try to hide, a brightness that arrived quickly before she could organize herself against it. He dismounted and walked over to the garden fence. "You're back early," she said. "I came to say something I didn't say last night," he said. She set down her trowel and stood up and looked at him across the fence, with her hands loosely at her sides and her hair coming loose in the morning wind, and she waited. "Violet," he said, and then he said the rest of it plainly and without decoration because that was the only way he knew how to say important things. "I have spent the better part of 3 months trying to be sensible about what I feel for you, and I'm not particularly succeeding. So I'd rather be honest about it than go on pretending I keep coming by to fix fences." She looked at him. The morning light was full and clear, no evasions possible in it. "I know," she said. "You know what I'm saying." "Yes," she said, "and I've been having the same argument with myself." "What's the argument?" She came around the garden fence and stopped a few feet from him, and she looked up at him with those direct, clear eyes. "The argument is that I do not know how to trust easily, and that you did something extraordinary for me without warning, and that makes me want to trust you, and that frightens me because I'm not sure I know the difference between gratitude and something else." "Do you know the difference now?" he asked. She considered this with the seriousness it deserved, the way Violet Graves considered everything that mattered. "Gratitude," she said slowly, "doesn't make you want to know what a person dreams about. It doesn't make you notice how they hold their coffee cup or the particular way they go quiet when they're thinking through a problem. Gratitude is warm, but it doesn't keep you awake at night." David looked at her for a long moment. "Does something keep you awake at night?" he asked quietly. She looked at him straight and said, "Yes." He reached out and tucked the strand of dark hair behind her ear, the one the wind kept pulling loose, and his fingers barely grazed her cheek in the process, and the contact was so light it was hardly anything at all, and yet both of them felt the full weight of it. "I'd like to court you properly," he said, "if you'll allow it." "I think," Violet said, with a gravity that was just barely undercut by something warmer, "that you have been courting me for 3 months already just quietly." He almost smiled. "Then I'd like to do it less quietly." She almost smiled back. "I think I could allow that." They began to court properly after that, which in Caldwell in 1878 meant that David would call at the farm on arranged evenings, that he was introduced to Eleanor Graves in the formal sense of a suitor being introduced, and that on Sunday afternoons they would sometimes drive together in David's wagon into town for the social hour that happened after the church service, where various people would see them together, and the town's collective intelligence on the matter would be updated accordingly. Eleanor Graves received David with a warmth that went beyond mere politeness. She was still not well. Her cough had improved, but her strength was slow in returning. But she had clarity of mind and sharpness of observation that her illness had not touched. She asked David questions with the particular directness of a woman who had once been a schoolteacher and had never fully stopped about his ranch, his plans, his family, his opinions on various matters. He answered her honestly, which she appreciated. He suspected she was used to men who answered women's questions with a sort of cheerful deflection, treating the question as a formality rather than a genuine inquiry, and his refusal to do that registered with her visibly. "You are," she told him on his third visit, when Violet was in the kitchen making coffee and Henry was out in the barn, "exactly the sort of man I hoped my daughter would find. I want you to know that, because I may not always have the opportunity to say things, and I would rather say them while I have the chance." David held her gaze and said, with complete sincerity, "Thank you, Mrs. Graves. I intend to deserve that." Eleanor nodded slowly, with the expression of a woman who has heard many promises in her life and is making a careful assessment of this one. "I believe you do," she said. Violet and David's courtship moved through the spring and into the Kansas summer, which arrived with its characteristic force, heat pressing down on the prairie like a physical weight, the sky becoming a flat, brilliant blue that offered no shade. The creek dropped, and the grass turned from green to gold, and the cattle on David's spread needed moving to the better grazing on the north pasture. David was managing his ranch and helping at the Graves farm and doing the mathematics of two enterprises, and Violet was managing the farm, nursing her mother, raising her brother, and planning the fall harvest. They were both busy people doing a great deal, and the time they had together was carved out of full days and was all the more valued for it. On a Thursday evening in late June, after supper at the farmhouse where David had helped Henry repair the chicken coop fence while Violet and Alina did the washing, they walked together along the creek path in the long evening light. The willows trailed their fingers in the low water and the meadowlarks were singing in the grasses, and the air was hot but moving, the particular alive heat of a prairie evening. They walked for a while in comfortable silence. Then Violet said, "Tell me something you've never told anyone." He was quiet for a moment, thinking. "When I left Tennessee," he said, "I didn't just leave to find opportunity. I left because I couldn't be who I was trying to be while I was there. The place held me in a shape that wasn't mine." She looked at him. "What shape was that?" "Smaller than I wanted to be," he said. "Quieter about things that mattered. There were expectations about how a man behaved and what he said and who he was, and I kept trying to fit them and failing, and eventually I realized that the fitting was the problem. And out here, he said, there is too much sky and too much trouble for anyone to have much energy left over for deciding who you should be." She laughed at that, the real and complete laugh, and he felt it go through him like warm water. "Your turn," he said. She thought for a moment. "When my father died," she said, "the first feeling I had before the grief was fear, purely practical fear, about the debt and the farm and how we would survive. And I felt guilty about that for weeks, that my first response was practical rather than heartbroken." "That's not guilt-worthy," David said. "That's what love looks like when it's been mixed with responsibility for long enough. Your father raised you to protect your family. Your first instinct in crisis was to protect them. He'd have been proud of that." She was quiet for a long beat. "That is," she said, "exactly the right thing to say." "I get lucky occasionally," he said. She stopped walking and turned to face him on the creek path, and the willows were behind her and the evening light was soft and gold around them. "David," she said. "Violet, I am in love with you," she said, simply and directly and without any of the elaborate hedging she might have employed 3 months ago. "I wanted to say it plainly because you deserve plainness from me." The evening was very still around them. "I've been in love with you," David said, "since you stood on that porch step in Caldwell and refused to let Silas Drummond make you small." She looked at him with those violet gray eyes, and then she stepped forward, and he met her, and he kissed her in the willow shade by the low-running creek, and it was the kind of kiss that resolves something that has been building for a long time, gentle and true and entirely unhurried, because neither of them had any interest in rushing past a moment they had both worked hard to arrive at. When they parted, she stayed close, her forehead near his shoulder, and he put his arms around her, and they stood in the evening on the creek bank with the meadowlarks singing and the smell of willows and warm grass around them. And it was one of those moments that the prairie gives you sometimes without warning, a moment of pure, uncomplicated grace. The summer deepened and the courtship deepened with it. They were in love openly now, which the town of Caldwell absorbed with the general goodwill that most people feel when they see something going the way things ought to go. Pete Garfield at the feed store said nothing further but grinned every time he saw David, which was its own form of commentary. There was a complication in July, which arrived in the form of a man named Abe Colton. Abe Colton was a rancher from 20 miles west of Caldwell, a man in his mid-30s who had done moderately well and who had decided, apparently sometime in early summer, that he was interested in Violet Graves. He was not a bad man exactly, but he was the kind of man who had never particularly questioned the assumption that what he wanted should eventually become his, and he had taken Violet's previous unavailability as merely a practical obstacle rather than an indication of her preferences. When he began calling at the farm, Violet was direct with him. She told him she was being courted, that she was not available, and that she appreciated his courtesy but could not encourage his attention. This was said clearly and without cruelty, and should have been the end of it. It was not entirely the end of it. Abe Colton, perhaps unaccustomed to being declined so decisively, came back twice more over the following weeks, and on the second occasion he was at the farm when David arrived, and there was a moment in the front yard that had the particular quality of a situation that could go several ways. David looked at Abe. Abe looked at David. Violet, who had positioned herself between them with the practical efficiency of a woman who has no patience for masculine posturing, said, "Mr. Colton is just leaving." Abe Colton looked at David for another long moment, making the calculations a man makes in such moments. Whatever he saw in David's face, which was calm and entirely without theater, must have informed those calculations adequately, because Abe tipped his hat to Violet, said something politely if stiffly to David, and rode away. After he was gone, David said nothing about it, and Violet loved him for that. She had expected some version of the territorial conversation, and he did not offer it because he understood, without being told, that Violet Graves had handled Abe Colton herself long before David arrived and continued to do so without requiring anyone's assistance. "Thank you for not making that into something it didn't need to be," she said. "You had it handled," David said. "I did," she agreed. "Did I ever suggest otherwise?" he asked. She looked at him. "No," she said, and something warm and certain moved through her. "No, you didn't." August came with its relentless heat and the sound of cattle drives passing through Caldwell on the trail, the dust and the noise of thousands of longhorns moving north, the shouting of cowboys and the creak of wagons. David watched a drive pass the road one afternoon, sitting on his horse at the fence line, and felt the complicated feeling a former trail cowhand feels when he watches something he used to be a part of, something that was hard and sometimes terrible, and also in some unrepeatable way fully alive. Violet was beside him on her own horse, a sensible roan mare named Clara that she rode with the practiced ease of someone who has been riding since childhood. She looked at the drive passing and said, "Did you ever miss it, the trail drives?" "Sometimes," David said, "the scope of it, the feeling that you're part of something that big and that moving. But you left." "I left because I wanted something that stayed put," he said. "Something that was mine and had roots in the ground." She looked at the cattle passing. "I understand that," she said. He looked at her. "I know you do." In the evenings that fall, after the harvest work that consumed most of September, David and Violet would sit on the porch of the farmhouse after supper, sometimes with Alina in her rocking chair when she was well enough, and talk about the future. They talked about it with increasing specificity, the way you talk about something that is beginning to feel less hypothetical and more imminent. One evening in October, with the air cooled to something bearable, and the stars coming out over the Kansas plain in their extravagant millions, David said what he had been building toward for some time. He had thought carefully about how to say it. He had turned it over in his mind for weeks, the way he turned over every significant thing, looking at it from different angles, making sure he meant it completely before he committed himself to it. He sat on the porch steps beside Violet and he said, "I want to marry you. I want to ask you to be my wife. But I want to ask you properly, which means telling you first what that would look like, so you're making an informed decision and not just a sentimental one." She turned to look at him. Her expression was very still and very attentive. "The ranch northeast of town," he said, "is mine outright. 420 acres, modest house, good barn, 40 head of cattle and growing. It is not grand, but it is solid and it is mine and it would be ours. Your farm," he continued, "is yours. I have no interest in absorbing it or folding it into anything. Henry is 15 and will be running it himself within a few years, and your mother's home is on it and will remain so. Those are separate things from what I'm proposing." He paused. She was listening with her full attention. "What I'm proposing is that we build something together," he said. "The two of us. Something that begins with what I have and what you are and grows from there. I am not offering you an easy life, Violet. This is hard country, and there is nothing simple about any of it. But I am offering you everything I have and everything I'm going to build, and myself along with it, for as long as I'm breathing." He looked at her steadily in the starlight. "Will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. The stars were enormous above them, and the night smelled of dry grass and cool air and distance. "Yes," she said. And then, because she was Violet Graves and plain speaking was in her bones, she said, "David, yes, of course yes. I have been waiting for you to ask me for 2 months." He let out a breath that was more than a breath. It was something he had been holding without fully knowing it, some tension that had lived in his chest since the morning he crossed the street in Caldwell to intervene in a situation that was none of his business, and that had turned out to be the most consequential morning of his life. He took her hands in both of his. 2 months, he said. "At least," she said, and she was almost laughing. "I wanted to be sure I had everything thought through," he said. "I know," she said. "That is one of the things I love about you, and also occasionally one of the things that tries my patience." He did smile then, fully and completely, and it transformed his face in a way that she had come to love specifically because it happened rarely and meant something real. "I'll try to think faster," he said. "Don't you dare," she said. "I love you the way you are." He brought her hands to his lips and kissed them, and above them the stars did their enormous, indifferent work, and below them the Kansas plains stretched away in every direction, and neither of them felt the distance or the difficulty of it, because the particular warmth of being chosen and choosing back is one of the few things in the world that can make the difficult seem simply like the landscape through which something good is moving. Eleanor Graves, when they told her the next morning, pressed both of David's hands in hers and said, "My husband would have loved you," and cried briefly and without embarrassment. Henry, when they told him, said good, with the compressed approval of a 15-year-old who has very strong feelings and very limited means of expressing them, and then immediately asked David if he could learn to work the cattle on the ranch come spring, which was Henry's way of saying that he trusted David and wanted to be part of whatever was being built. "Come spring," David said. "Absolutely." They were married in November of 1878, on a clear and cold Saturday, in the small white church at the east end of Caldwell's Main Street. The minister was a man named Reverend Alcott, who was brief and sincere, two qualities Violet had specifically requested. Violet wore a dress of cream-colored cotton, not elaborate. There was no time or money for elaborate, but fitted and carefully made by a woman in town named Mrs. Haverstock, who had a gift for such things. She had flowers in her dark hair, small late autumn wildflowers that Henry had actually gone out and found for her in the morning frost, which had made Violet hug him so hard he complained about it. David wore his best shirt, which was dark blue, and his good coat, and he had trimmed his hair and his jaw was clean-shaved. When Violet came down the aisle of that small church on Henry's arm, because Henry was the man of the Graves family now, and took the duty with the utmost gravity, David looked at her and felt the full and undeniable weight of what was happening with a clarity that made everything else in the room go slightly peripheral. She saw his face when she reached him, and she squeezed his hands when she took them, because she could read him well enough by now to know what that expression meant. The vows, they said, were the traditional ones, to have and to hold, from this day forward, in sickness and in health, and David said them with the same deliberate certainty with which he said everything that mattered, and Violet said them with her chin up and her eyes clear, and the quiet ring of a woman who means every single word. After, outside the church in the November cold, there was a general celebration of the modest and heartfelt variety, with people shaking hands and saying kind things, and Pete Garfield saying to David, with a grin so wide it was practically geographic, "Told you that road was getting a lot of use." "You told me nothing of the sort," David said. "I implied it," Pete said, which is the same thing. They had their wedding supper at the farmhouse, with a leaner at the table and Henry, who had made a real effort with the meal, having asked Mrs. Haverstock for instructions on preparing a proper feast, and executed it with more competence than anyone had expected. There was good food and good conversation, and when the evening cooled and the lamp burned low, David and Violet drove together out to the ranch northeast of town, which was now their home. The house was modest, 2 rooms and a kitchen and a good covered porch, and David had spent the previous month making it as ready as he could, which meant clean and stocked, and with a fire laid in the hearth that he had lit before leaving for the wedding. When they arrived and walked in out of the cold, the fire was going and the room was warm, and the whole place felt, for the first time in David's 7 years on the land, like somewhere that had been waiting to be more than it was. Violet stood in the middle of the main room and looked around at it with the same attentiveness she gave everything. "We'll make this bigger," she said, "when we can." That east wall could come out and the room extended, more light from the south if you put in another window. David watched her look at his house and see what it could become. "Yes," he said. She turned and found him watching her, and she came to him and stood close and put her hands on his chest and looked up at him. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For everything," she said. "For the morning in Caldwell, for coming back, for all of it." He put his arms around her. "I'd do it again," he said. "Every bit of it." She pressed her face into the warmth of his shoulder and felt the absolute certain solidity of him around her. This man who had arrived in her life like something the prairie had simply decided to produce, unexpected and extraordinary and entirely real. "I know you would," she said. The winter of 1878 moving into 1879 was hard, as Kansas winters tended to be, with blizzards that came off the plains with no warning and kept you pinned inside for days, and cold that drove itself under every door and through every gap in every wall. But the ranch house held, and they were warm, and there was food enough, and they had each other, which made the enormous white silence of the plains feel more like privacy than isolation. David worked through the winter managing the cattle, cutting and hauling the ice from the pond when needed, maintaining the fences and the barn with the particular focused patience of a man who understands that a ranch is a system of things that must all be kept in order or the whole collapses. Violet managed the household with the same quality of attention, and also kept in close contact with the farm, riding over to see Alina and Henry several times a week when the weather allowed. Alina's health improved marginally that winter, enough for her to sit at the table and take her meals and sometimes, on good days, to walk to the kitchen garden and back. David never commented on how often Violet's first instinct in any good news was to share it with her mother. He understood that the bond between them was something that needed no commentary, only room. Henry, who came to the ranch every weekend through the winter as agreed, proved himself a quick and capable worker. He and David developed a relationship that was part mentor and apprentice, and part something simpler than that. 2 people who understood each other's way of approaching a task and respected it. Henry was going to be a good man. He already had the bones of it. By spring, Violet was expecting their first child. She told David on a morning in March when the snow had finally released its grip on the plains and the first green was appearing at the creek bank, tentative and astonishing. She told him simply and directly, as she told him everything, watching his face as she did. David Hudson, who was not a man given to dramatic display, went very still for a moment, and then he crossed the room in 3 steps and took her in his arms with a gentleness that was somehow more expressive than anything he could have said. "Are you well?" he asked against her hair. "I'm well," she said. "Better than well." He held her for a long time. "I'm terrified," he said quietly with the honesty that was one of the things she loved most about him. "So am I," she said. "But we'll manage, we always manage." He pulled back to look at her face, and what was on his own was something she had seen pieces of before but never the whole of, not quite like this, a completeness of feeling that he usually kept partitioned behind his natural reticence, spilling out past his guard. "I love you," he said. It was a thing he said regularly and always meant entirely, but this time it carried an additional weight, a love that had expanded to contain something new and terrifying and magnificent. "I know," she said. "I love you too. Now go tend the cattle because I am going to sit on the porch and be absolutely stunned for a little while, and I'd like to do that alone." He laughed, which was the real thing, unguarded and warm, the laugh she had been working to earn since the beginning and which she now had access to in a way that felt like a specific and personal gift. He went to tend the cattle, and she sat on the porch in the March morning with the green coming up along the creek bank, and the sky beginning to do interesting things after months of winter gray. And she sat in the complete and astonished happiness of a woman who has built something real. The summer of 1879 brought the baby, born on a hot July morning with the help of the town midwife, a woman named Mrs. Clara Potts, who had delivered more than half of Caldwell's children, and had the particular competence and authority of someone who had seen every version of this particular situation and knew exactly what to do in all of them. It was a boy. David was outside on the porch for the whole of it, which was customary and also consistent with his nature, because he found waiting for things he could not control to be one of the more demanding tests of his composure. Henry was with him, having come from the farm when they sent word. They sat in silence mostly, which was its own form of company, when Mrs. Potts came to the door and said, "Mother and son, both doing fine." David stood up so quickly he knocked the porch chair over, which Henry observed and filed away as one of the more human things he had ever seen David Hudson do. They named the boy Thomas Samuel Hudson, Thomas for no particular reason beyond both of them liking the sound of it, and Samuel for Violet's father. Thomas was born with a full head of dark hair and a general disposition that suggested he intended to be heard, which he demonstrated comprehensively from his first hours. Violet with the baby in her arms was something David came back to look at every time he came into the room, the way you find yourself returning to a painting that does something to you. She held the boy with the same attentive sureness with which she did everything, and she talked to him in a low voice that David could not always hear but that Thomas clearly found satisfactory, because he would settle when she spoke. Alina came to see the baby 3 days after the birth, David driving her carefully in the wagon, and she held Thomas and wept in the way that elderly women weep at new life, with a gladness that is also tinged with the awareness of how brief everything is. She held the baby for a long time and talked to him as though he could understand her, which perhaps he could in some way, because he looked at her face with the intense concentration of a very new person examining an interesting new thing. Henry held his nephew with the awkwardness of a 16-year-old, who is terrified of doing something wrong and immensely proud of this new relationship, and unsure how to express either feeling. He held the boy carefully and looked at his face for a while and said, "He's got the Graves eyes," which was true. The baby had the violet-gray shade that Violet had, slightly altered to something more blue-gray, but clearly from the same source. "He has," David agreed. Henry looked at David. "Good," he said, in the same compressed way he expressed everything important. And then he handed the baby back very carefully and went outside and spent 45 minutes making himself busy in the barn, which was Henry's way of processing large feelings. The years that followed were full in the way that the best years are full, not easy. The frontier was never easy, but full of things that mattered and things that grew. The ranch expanded. David bought the adjacent 200 acres in 1880 when the holder of the title decided to go back east, and he and Henry, who was spending more and more time at the ranch as a genuine working hand, spent the following spring fencing the new pasture. David traded for new cattle with money saved carefully across 2 years, and the herd grew to the point where he needed to hire 2 regular hands, young men from town named Billy Crane and Jorge Reyes, who were reliable workers and who became a permanent part of the rhythm of the place. Violet ran the household with one hand and the books with the other, because she was the better mathematician and David knew it, and said so without any visible discomfort, which continued to be one of the things she loved about him. She kept the accounts and tracked the expenses and the income, and had opinions about which investments made sense and which didn't. And David listened to her opinions the way he had always listened, with the full engagement of someone who considers what another person says, because they actually believe the other person has something worth considering. The farm on the South Fork continued as well. Henry, now 17 and then 18 and then 19, grew into the management of it with the sureness of someone who has been raised to understand what he's doing. He hired a hand himself, an older man named Cal Whitmore who had retired from trail driving on account of his knees and was glad for steadier work. The farm under Henry's management began to produce a genuine surplus for the first time, and Henry sold the grain at a price that made Violet proud in a way she made sure to tell him about directly, because Henry was someone who needed to hear things said rather than implied. Eleanor Graves lived to see her grandchildren. In 1881, Violet and David had a second child, a girl they named Clara Rose Hudson, Clara after the roan mare that had carried Violet on her rides along Hackberry Creek through their courtship, and Rose because Eleanor had always loved roses and had grown them in the kitchen garden at the farm with a particular dedication. Clara was born with David's eyes, the warm amber brown, and Violet's stubbornness, which showed itself early and comprehensively. She was from the first year of her life a person of very decided opinions about what she wanted, and when she wanted it, and the general household, including Thomas, who was 3 years old and fascinated by this new small person who seemed to operate on principles entirely different from his own, reorganized somewhat around her. Eleanor held Clara on a good afternoon that summer, sitting in the rocking chair that David had carried out to the porch for her, and she looked at the baby's face with an expression that Violet, standing nearby, committed completely to memory. "Your father," Eleanor said softly, meaning Samuel Graves, "would have been so happy." "I know," Violet said. "He would have liked David very much," Eleanor said. "He would have liked that David fixed fences without being asked," Violet said, and Eleanor laughed, which was the truest and most complete sound Violet had heard from her in a long time. Eleanor Graves passed away quietly in the autumn of 1882 in her room at the farm, with Henry beside her and Violet holding her hand. She had been declining slowly through the summer, and everyone who loved her had known the direction of it, and had done what people do in such times, sat with her and talked and made sure she knew she was not alone, and that what she had built would be kept. David came as soon as Henry sent word, and he and Violet sat together on the porch of the farmhouse in the October evening, and he held her while she cried, not trying to fix it or redirect it, simply being present with his arms around her and letting the grief be as large as it needed to be. "She knew she was loved," he said after a long time. "Yes," Violet said. "She knew the farm was safe, she knew you were safe, she knew Henry was safe." "Yes," Violet said again. "She got to hold both of your children," he said. "She had that." Violet pressed her face into his shoulder. "Thank you for giving me time with her," she said. "For never making me feel as though the visits to the farm were taking me away from the ranch." "They weren't taking you away from anything," he said. "She was your family." "So are you," she said. "Yes," he said. "All of it is true at once." They buried Eleanor Graves in the small cemetery at the edge of town, next to Samuel, and Henry stood at the graveside with the controlled composure of a young man who is working very hard at being strong and mostly succeeding, and Violet stood beside David and held his hand through the whole service. The winter after Eleanor's death was a winter of settling, of grief working its way into a new shape that could be carried. Violet and David and Thomas and baby Clara filled the ranch house with the ordinary remarkable noise of a family, and Henry came on Sundays and sometimes stayed through Monday. And slowly the grief became something that was part of the foundation rather than the whole of the weight. In the spring of 1883, something unexpected occurred that was not grief at all, but was in fact the opposite of it. Henry Graves, now 20 years old and running the Hackberry Creek farm with genuine competence and a growing reputation for reliable grain, came to dinner on a Sunday with an expression on his face that David read immediately and Violet read slightly after David, and both of them managed to say nothing about it until Henry himself brought it up, which he did at the end of the meal by saying, with characteristic compression, "I'd like to tell you something." The something was that Henry had met a young woman named Anna Briggs, whose family had a homestead on the other side of Caldwell, and that he intended to court her, and that he wanted David and Violet to know because they were the people whose opinion mattered most to him. Violet looked at her brother across the table and felt something enormous and warm move through her chest. "Tell me about her," she said. Henry told them about her. Anna Briggs was 19. With red hair and an apparently formidable capacity for arguing about agricultural prices, which Henry had discovered at the grain market in town and apparently found deeply appealing. She was clever and practical, and she laughed easily, which Henry reported with the slightly dazed expression of someone who has recently discovered that laughing easily is a quality that affects him more than he expected. "Bring her to supper," Violet said. Henry looked as though he had been hoping she would say this but had not dared assume it. "Would that be appropriate?" "Of course it would," Violet said. "Your family, she matters to you. She's welcome." Henry looked at David. David said, "What your sister said." Henry nodded once, the single nod agreement that was his signature, and something visibly relaxed in him. Anna Briggs came to supper the following Sunday, and she was exactly as described, red-haired and direct-spoken, and entirely unintimidated by the scrutiny of meeting the family. And she brought a jar of preserved peaches from her mother's kitchen as a gift, which Violet received as the social grace it was and appreciated as the practical gesture it also was. She and Violet talked across the supper table for 2 hours while Henry and David did the particular thing that men do when they are both comfortable and have nothing pressing to argue about, which was to talk companionably about cattle and fencing and the coming season's expectations. At the end of the evening, after Henry and Anna had driven back toward town, David and Violet stood on the porch in the warm spring dark, and Violet leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her. "She's good for him," Violet said. "Yes," David said. "He looks at her the way you looked at me in the beginning," Violet said, "before you would let yourself show it properly." David considered this. "Was it that obvious?" "Only to me," she said, "because I was looking for it." "Were you?" She turned her head to look up at him. "I was hoping for it," she said, "which amounts to the same thing." He kissed her temple, that comfortable, familiar gesture of a man entirely at home with the person beside him. "You know," he said, "I think about that morning in Caldwell sometimes." "What about it?" "I think about what would have happened if I'd gone into the general store on the other side of the street," he said. "If I hadn't heard the argument, if I'd picked up my wire and ridden home." "Nothing," she said simply. "Nothing would have happened. You'd have gone home and I'd have lost the farm and we'd never have known what we missed." "That's what I think about," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Do you regret Monarch?" she asked. It was a question she had never directly asked him in all the years. He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything. "I miss him," he said. "I won't pretend otherwise. He was an extraordinary horse and I raised him from nothing, but I'd make the same trade tomorrow." "You did it without knowing me," she said. "I did it because it was right," he said. "The fact that it led to you was the world being generous in a way I didn't expect and didn't ask for." She was quiet for another moment, and then she said, "Come with me." She led him into the barn, past the stalls where the working horses stood in the warm dark, past the tack room where the saddles hung and the smell of leather and hay was thick and good. In the last stall, the biggest one, stood a horse she had acquired 3 months ago from a man who was moving on and needed to sell quickly. She had not told David the full extent of her reasoning for the purchase. She had said only that the price was good and the animal was sound. He was a black stallion. Not monarch, no horse was monarch, but a black stallion with a white blaze down his nose and the broad chest and powerful hindquarters of an animal bred for quality. He was 3 years old and entirely untrained beyond the basics, and he had been something of a project for Violet over the past months. David stood at the stall door and looked at the horse, and the horse looked back at him with dark, calm eyes. "Violet," David said. "He's not monarch," she said. "He'll never be monarch, but he's fine bloodlines and he's young and he's sound, and I thought that perhaps you might want to begin again. With the breeding program, the one you had to set aside." He looked at the horse for a long time. "I know it's not the same thing," she said quietly. "But you gave up something enormous for us, and I know it mattered, and I wanted to give you back as much of it as I could." David turned to look at her. In the low light of the barn, her violet-gray eyes were steady and warm and entirely her. This woman who paid attention to everything and remembered everything and turned her care into action as instinctively as she breathed. "What will we name him?" David said. She smiled, and it was the full smile, the one that had been worth every carefully placed word since the beginning. "I thought you should name him," she said. He looked at the horse again. The animal was young and solid and stood with the particular quality of a horse that has good sense and good blood and has not yet been shown what it's capable of. "Prince," David said. "Prince," Violet agreed. He opened the stall door and went in and stood with the young horse in the way he had learned to stand with horses, quietly and without demand, letting the animal come to the assessment of him in its own time. Prince turned his head and regarded David with those dark eyes, and then stepped forward and pressed his nose into David's shoulder with the deliberate exploratory quality of a horse deciding something. David put his hand on the horse's neck. "All right," he said quietly. "All right then." He looked over his shoulder at Violet, who was leaning on the stall door watching him with an expression that was so entirely full of love that it had given up trying to contain itself. "Come here," he said. She came into the stall and he put his free arm around her, and the three of them stood in the warm barn dark, and the prairie night was big and still around them, and the stars above the open barn door were thick as salt on black cloth. "I love you," David said, against her hair. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you since before I knew what to call it." "Since the fence post evenings?" he asked. "Since before that," she said. "Since the morning you stood in the street and looked at Silas Drummond like he was a mild inconvenience and gave away your finest horse without blinking." "I blinked," he said. "Internally." She laughed, the real laugh against his chest. "I know," she said. "I saw." The years that followed that barn evening were the kind of years that a person looks back on from the far end of their life and recognizes as the core of it, the years when everything they had worked toward and hoped for was actually daily present. Not without difficulty. The frontier had difficulty built into it like grain and wood. It was structural and could not be removed. There were dry summers and a hard economic year when cattle prices fell, and they had to make careful decisions about what to keep and what to sell. There were illnesses and injuries, nothing catastrophic, but the ordinary accumulations of a physical life in a hard country. There were arguments between David and Violet, real ones, because they were two strong-minded people with opinions and the freedom to express them, and they argued occasionally about money and occasionally about the ranch decisions, and once memorably, about whether to repaint the house, which somehow became a conversation about 4 other things entirely before resolving itself. But the arguments always resolved. That was one of the qualities of their life together. Neither of them was interested in leaving things unfinished. They had both seen enough of what happened when things were left to fester and become permanent, and they had both chosen a different approach, the harder but more durable approach of staying in the room until the thing was said and heard and worked through. Henry married Anna Briggs in 1884, at the same small white church where David and Violet had married, and Henry wore a suit that was slightly too long in the sleeve and didn't care at all. And Anna wore blue and laughed during the vows in a way that made the minister briefly lose his place. And Thomas Hudson, who was 5 years old, served as a kind of unofficial usher by directing people to seats with great authority and no particular accuracy. The farm on Hackberry Creek became Henry and Anna's home. They worked it together and it flourished, because both of them understood what they had and were willing to put in what it required. Henry never forgot that the farm existed because of David Hudson. He never said so in so many words, because Henry was Henry and compression was his native language, but he showed it in the particular respect with which he always treated David, not as a man he owed something to, but as a man he genuinely admired, which was the better thing. By 1886, Thomas was 7 and Clara was 5, and they were the most comprehensively individual children Violet had ever encountered, which she said sometimes with exasperation, and always with a fundamental and bedrock pride. Thomas was methodical and quiet and already interested in everything about the ranch, following David around the property with the focused attention of someone who is studying rather than simply accompanying. Clara was the force of nature, loud and curious and entirely fearless in the way that the second child of confident people sometimes is, having been watching competent adults all her short life, and concluding that competence was simply a matter of deciding to do something. There was an afternoon in the summer of 1886 that Violet would return to in her memory many times over the years. David had taken both children to the creek to fish, which Thomas loved with a patient seriousness, and Clara engaged with as a personal competition against the fish, which she intended to win. Violet had stayed at the house to write letters, but after an hour she set the letters down and walked out to the creek bank. From a slight distance, she could see them on the bank. David was sitting in the grass between the two children, his hat pushed back on his head, apparently explaining something to Thomas about reading the current while Clara was already knee-deep in the shallows doing her own experimentation. She could hear their voices but not the words, David's low and even, Thomas's careful and questioning, Clara's periodically loud and triumphant. She stood in the afternoon light and looked at the three of them and felt it move through her, that particular quality of happiness that is not excitement but is something deeper and more permanent, the happiness of knowing that you are in exactly the right place with exactly the right people, that the sequence of events that brought you here, no matter how painful or difficult in the moment, was the sequence that needed to happen. She thought about her father. She thought about standing on that porch step in Caldwell in the spring of 1878, holding the fence of her composure with everything she had, looking at Silas Drummond and feeling the farm slipping away and refusing to show it. She thought about the sound of footsteps crossing the road behind her, and a man she had never seen before saying to the most powerful person in town, in a voice of complete and unimpressed calm, "I want to propose a trade." She thought about the horse, the black stallion with the white blaze, walking away down the main street of Caldwell. She thought about asking him why, and his answer, which was the most honest answer she had ever received from anyone, stripped of pretension or calculation, because it was the right thing to do. She thought about the morning he came back to the kitchen garden, not on a Saturday, and said what he had not said the night before in the barn. She walked down to the creek bank. David heard her coming and turned, and when he saw her his face did the thing she loved, that arriving warmth that he had never quite learned to suppress and that she had long since stopped wanting him to. "Come to fish," he said. "Come to watch," she said, settling herself in the grass beside him. Clara from the shallows said, "I already caught one," with the authority of someone who expects this to be recognized as the significant achievement it is. "Good work," Violet said. "I let it go," Clara added. "Even better," Violet said. Thomas, beside his father, was studying the water with his characteristic patience. He was going to catch something, Violet knew it, he would wait until he did. David's hand found hers in the grass between them. "You're thinking," he said quietly. "How do you always know?" "You get a particular look," he said, "far away but not absent." She turned to look at him, this man who had known her for 8 years now and could read her at 50 yards. "I was thinking about gratitude," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Real gratitude," she said. "Not the owing kind, the kind that's just a recognition of how fortunate you are." He looked at the creek and the children and the cottonwood trees along the bank and the enormous Kansas sky above all of it. "Yes," he said, "I know exactly what you mean." Thomas pulled his line up at that moment, and there was indeed a fish on it, a small but respectable catfish, and he held it up with the contained satisfaction of someone whose patience has been vindicated. And Clara splashed over to examine it with the competitiveness of someone assessing a rival's score. And David and Violet looked at each other in the particular way of parents who are sharing the private amusement of watching their children be themselves. And the creek went on talking to itself between the willow banks, and the afternoon light lay over the Kansas plain in that wide flat gold that made everything look like something worth painting. And the two of them sat in the grass of the bank they had come to together, through a sequence of events that began with a debt and a horse and a morning decision that changed everything, and they were entirely and completely at home. In 1887, on a clear fall day when the cottonwoods along Hackberry Creek had turned to gold, and the air had the cold clarity that meant winter was coming, but had not quite arrived, David and Violet rode out together to the south pasture to check the fence line before the season turned. It was something they did together when they could, not for any practical reason that required two people, but because they liked it, the simple, uncomplicated pleasure of riding side by side across their own land in the particular companionship of two people who have built something together and can look at it without reservation. They came to the high point of the south pasture, where the land lifted slightly and you could see in every direction across the prairie, south toward Hackberry Creek and east toward town and north toward the far distant line of the horizon. David stopped his horse. Violet stopped beside him. They sat in the saddle in the fall light and looked at what they could see from where they were standing, which was a great deal. The ranch house visible in the middle distance, the barn, the winter garden. The track of road heading south toward Hackberry Creek, the smoke from a chimney somewhere, probably Henry and Anna's farmhouse. "We've done all right," David said. "We've done better than all right," Violet said. He looked at her, this woman who had refused to be made small by anything the world had thrown at her, who had turned grief and difficulty and uncertainty into the foundation of something real and lasting, who had looked at him one morning across a fence in a kitchen garden and told him plainly that she loved him. "Yes," he said, "better than all right." She reached across from her horse to his and took his hand, and they stayed there for a moment on the high point of the south pasture with the fall light gold around them and the wind moving through the grass below and the whole of what they had made spreading out in every direction from where they sat. "David," she said. "Violet, thank you," she said, "for everything you did in the beginning and everything you've done since." He shook his head slightly. "You don't owe me thanks, you never did." "I know," she said. "That's what makes it worth giving." He held her hand in the cold air and they looked at the land they had built together. And behind them the sky was the enormous indifferent blue of the Kansas fall. And below them the grass moved in its old instinctive way, bending to the wind and rising again, as it always had and would go on doing long after they were gone. But right now, in this moment, it was theirs. Henry and Anna welcomed their first child, a son they named Samuel, in 1888, which made Violet the kind of happy that is also complicated by the awareness of the person who should have been there to see it. She and David drove to the Hackberry Creek farm the day the baby came, and she held her nephew and sat with her brother, and cried a little and laughed more. And David sat at Henry's kitchen table and drank coffee with Cal Whitmore, who was still on the farm and had become in all practical terms a member of the extended family. And they talked about the coming season and said very little about the obvious magnitude of what had just happened, because that was the way both of them were. By 1889, Thomas was 10 and asking serious questions about the management of the ranch, specifically about the breeding program that David had been developing with Prince, who had grown into an exceptional stallion and had begun producing foals of the quality David had originally planned for Monarch. The first 2 foals had been sold at prices that represented a genuine inflection point for the ranch's financial position, and the third, a dark bay mare they were keeping for their own working string, was everything David had hoped for when he first laid out the breeding strategy years before. Thomas understood the significance of the horses. He had grown up watching his father work with them, and he asked questions with the same methodical seriousness that characterized everything he did. David answered him with the same respect he gave anyone who asked a genuine question, regardless of their age. And so Thomas at 10 was receiving a practical education in animal husbandry and business planning that would serve him well for the rest of his life. Clara at 8 was less interested in horses as a business proposition and more interested in them as a personal relationship, and she had adopted a particular pony, a gray and extremely opinionated animal named Dust, as her specific domain. She and Dust understood each other on terms that were entirely their own, and that sometimes baffled everyone else, which suited Clara completely. There was an evening in the fall of 1889 when the whole extended family was gathered at the ranch house, which had been expanded. The east wall had come out as Violet had foreseen on her very first evening in the house, and there were now 3 bedrooms and a proper sitting room and a larger kitchen. Henry and Anna were there with young Samuel, who was 1 year old and had Henry's eyes and Anna's red hair and an already conspicuous personality. Thomas and Clara were at the table doing their lessons before supper. David was on the porch with Henry going over something about the fencing on the shared boundary line between the properties. Violet was in the kitchen making supper, and she could hear all of it at once. The children at the table, Clara explaining something to Thomas with the expansive authority she brought to all instruction, and Thomas listening with patient skepticism. Henry and David on the porch, their voices low and comfortable. Baby Samuel making the particular sound a satisfied baby makes when he's being held and feels no immediate grievances. Anna came into the kitchen to help with the supper, and the 2 of them worked together in the good warm space with the smell of cooking around them, and the voices of their families audible through the walls and windows. "Are you happy?" Anna asked, at one point, in the simple direct way she asked everything. Violet looked at the kitchen around her and through the window at the porch where David sat talking to her brother, and she thought about a morning in 1878, and a debt and a horse and a man crossing a street in Caldwell, and everything that had grown from that single morning like a tree growing from a single seed. "Yes," she said, with the simple directness of a woman who knows the difference between the word and the thing. "Completely." The last light of that fall evening came through the kitchen window and lay across the floor in a long bar of gold, and the supper was almost ready, and outside the Kansas sky was doing its particular extravagant performance, layers of orange and pink deepening to the blue of dusk, and the cottonwoods along the creek were gold, and the children were calling to each other from the table, and David's voice from the porch carried that particular low warmth it had when he was easy and unguarded. And all of it was true and real and entirely, permanently theirs. David came inside a few minutes later, ducking through the doorway he always had to duck through, and he looked at Violet across the kitchen with the look he still had, that arriving warmth that 8 years had not diminished but had in fact deepened into something more fundamental and more constant, the way a river deepens in its bed over time. She handed him a coffee cup. "Supper in 20 minutes," she said. He took the cup and stood beside her at the window, looking out at the fall evening, their shoulders touching. "Violet," he said, "David, I've been thinking about the east pasture," he said, "for the spring foal." She made the precise sound that indicated she was listening and knew there was more. "And also," he said more quietly, about how this is exactly what I hoped for when I was building this place alone and couldn't quite imagine it clearly, and now I don't have to imagine it. She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. No, she agreed. Now you don't. Outside, the Kansas evening settled into its vast and comfortable dark, and the stars came out one by one over the prairie. And inside the ranch house on the northeast road out of Caldwell, the lights burned warm against the dark, and the voices of a family going about the ordinary, extraordinary business of their lives filled the rooms that had been built and expanded and added to. And everything that had been started on a bruised spring morning in 1878, with a single act of clear-eyed generosity, had grown into something that filled all the available space and still had room to keep growing. And in the barn, Prince moved in his stall with the quiet confidence of an animal who knows where he belongs, and the prairie night was enormous around the ranch, and the grass moved in the wind the way it always had, and somewhere in the deep middle of that good ordinary evening, David Hudson and Violet Graves, who had found each other through a debt and a horse, and the simple incalculable power of one person deciding to do right by another, were exactly where they were supposed to be.